Curious to know about how Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are doing in development? Well, gear up, because we have some new deets on what's cooking in the oven. I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. I'm johtojonny, a gaming analyst here on YouTube that searches far and wide for the most hidden details and information on video games. A few days ago, I released a video detailing GameFreak's structure to analyze just how far along Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are in development. There's some great news for the games included in that video, so I highly encourage you to take a look at it right after this one. Today's information comes courtesy of Joe Merrick, the man behind Cerebi.net, who DM'd me on Twitter to inform us on GameFreak's developmental practices. Joe's confirmed for me that he does indeed have insight into Pokemon's release process thanks to insider info. So, without further ado, let's discuss their inner workings and how it all comes together. To start, Joe confirmed that GameFreak does indeed work on around 2 Pokemon games at a time by default. The primary focus is always the newest generation, which has anywhere between 2 to 4 years of development. I should make something very clear that I forgot to mention in my last video though. Development cycles do not include just the coding and modeling segments. Keep in mind that they also include planning, conceptualizing, designing, playtesting, and more. Sometimes, even just the planning segment can eat away at development time. GameFreak has mentioned in interviews before that Sword and Shield had an especially long planning phase and conceptualizing phase, which toyed heavily with ideas of changing the amount of Pokemon in the parties or the amount of moves a Pokemon could have at a time. We sort of saw the fruits of this planning in Pokemon Legends, where players can switch out their moves on the fly, but unfortunately, GameFreak was running out of time during Sword and Shield's planning and ended up just sticking to the tried and true formula, while being able to implement that idea later thanks to a fresh development cycle for Pokemon Legends. This also means we'll most likely see this new move system in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and possibly even some further changes as well. Now, let's discuss the distribution of team members at GameFreak. I've mentioned worst case scenarios in my last video, but it turns out the truth of distribution is actually closer to my best case scenario that I created. The Gear project seems to be something more on the side for GameFreak. We've all been super confused since they've contradicted themselves in interviews by stating Gear is the biggest focus at the company. Perhaps this was a bad translation, or perhaps they misspoke? Regardless, subsequent interviews and Joe Merrick's knowledge of developmental practices almost fully confirms that Gear is not the primary focus and that it's something GameFreak members can work on when they get time away from working on Pokemon games. Now, Gear aside, I've mentioned the focus is new generations of Pokemon games. I've also mentioned that there are usually about 2 Pokemon games in development at once. So how does this work? Let's take a look at the release of Sword and Shield up until Scarlet and Violet's release as an example. So, Sword and Shield is beginning development. Pre-coding phases have begun, meaning programmers and a bunch of other roles aren't needed yet for the new generation. What are they working on then? At this time, it would have been Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon, as well as Pokemon Let's Go PV, both of which would have already finished their pre-coding phase, allowing for the planners and conceptualizers to move on to the next projects. Now, I'm sure some other roles have some layover when it comes to developing all these games as a whole, and with their free work time, they can work on Gear project games, such as Little Town Hero in this case, or even begin working on the next Pokemon project early depending on what planning processes have finished for each individual game. By the time planning and conceptualizing Sword and Shield was over, the coders from Ultra Sun and Moon and Let's Go PV can dive right into programming Sword and Shield, while the planners and conceptualizers can begin splitting up into planning the next few projects. In this case, the smallest team would start planning the Sword and Shield DLC, the next team to begin planning Pokemon Legends Arceus, and the largest team will begin planning Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, intermingling with each other as needed to maintain some sense of cohesion and consistency between releases. Once again, by the time planning and conceptualizing for these games comes to a close, the programmers for Pokemon Sword and Shield will have finished and can dive right into the next few projects, being the DLC, Legends Arceus, and Scarlet Violet, spaced out over the different times that planning has been finished for each respective game. Obviously, the DLC planning would have finished relatively quickly compared to the others, and there will have been plenty of GameFreak members ready to begin work on that while Sword and Shield's base game was still being developed. All this is to say, there's constant overlap between the games being developed, and any layovers in the different roles get time to work on Gear games. It's also worth clarifying too, the speed of development between different kinds of Pokemon titles. As I hinted earlier, third versions and DLC, such as Ultra Sun and Moon, don't need nearly the same amount of members working on them in any given phase, as the games were already mostly planned and completed upon their first versions released, so more members are definitely involved in the remakes and new generations. Remakes also don't need quite as much, about somewhere in the middle of third versions and new generations, since map design and other game aspects were already mostly predetermined upon the original releases as well. This means most members do work on new generational games, and that makes perfect sense. Pokemon Legends Arceus is a sort of exception to this rule though, as it was not just a remake so much as a complete reimagining of Generation 4, so it needed more development time in general than a typical remake. I'm also willing to bet there was more overlap than usual between the teams that made Pokemon Legends and Scarlet and Violet, since they seem very similar in the way of innovation. Which makes sense because, you know what other game was an exception to the rules I've laid out? Pokemon Sword and Shield. GameFreak's Shigeru Omori has mentioned in an interview semi-recently that Sword and Shield was created by mostly newcomers to the company. Knowing this, it's safe to assume that the most seasoned members of GameFreak were definitely working on Pokemon Legends and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, giving both games more time and resources than usual. We can even further speculate based on this knowledge that the newcomers who worked on Sword and Shield will be working on whatever project comes after Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Personally, I'm hoping it's just the Scarlet and Violet DLC, but if it is a new game, I really do hope they've learned a lot of lessons from making Sword and Shield so that they can do better this time. Finally, where does this leave Gear? It seems like, with all these Pokemon games going on simultaneously, Gear doesn't actually have time to breathe, and you'd be right. Which is why I'm going to clarify GameFreak's use of outsourcing. It's heavily implied that Little Town Hero, GameFreak's most recent Gear title, was heavily outsourced just to be completed. But it's not just their Gear games. GameFreak outsources a lot in general in all their games, especially since the jump to 3D for Pokemon. Creatures Inc. handles making the Pokemon models, Monolith Soft has been outsourced at least twice to help with map design for the open areas of Sword and Shield and Pokemon Legends Arceus, and if you look at the credit rolls for the more recent Pokemon games, it really doesn't stop there. Heck, Ilka Inc. was even outsourced to create an entire Pokemon remake, as well as an entire app that allows transferring Pokemon between mainline games. Outsourcing is a practice a lot of companies take part in, and GameFreak is no different, even if it's to a larger extent. Perhaps one day we'll see GameFreak grow its own staff to the size it needs to be so that they don't need to rely on outsourcing so much, but until then, feel free to go watch my other video on how far along Scarlet and Violet are in development, and also comment your thoughts here on these new revelations down below. Until the next video everyone, I've been johtojonny. Peace out.